Mr. Whitfield, those were not graves. They were obstacles.
Clarissa Dunmore said that to my face. Standing in the mud where 12 headstones used to be, the oldest dating back to 1893, diesel smoke still hanging in the air, the iron fence twisted into a scrap pile behind her. Clipboard in hand, smile in place. 130 years of graves, gone in a single weekend. Bulldozed to make room for the fourth hole of a golf course that maybe 11 people in the neighborhood even used. I stood there and made her a promise she didn't take seriously. She should have taken it seriously. What would you do if someone looked at your family's graves and called them obstacles? Drop it in the comments, because what I did next took 18 months, 3 lawyers, 1 county assessor, and 1 very satisfying Wednesday morning at the Allegheny County Courthouse. Where are you watching from tonight? Let me know, because this one's for everyone who's ever had a petty little tyrant try to run their life from a clipboard. Let me back up. My name is Garrison Whitfield, retired pipe fitter. 31 years laying natural gas lines across 4 states, most of it West Virginia, some of it Pennsylvania, a stretch of Ohio I try not to remember because of the winters. I drive a '09 F-150 with a cracked dashboard and a back seat that permanently smells like coffee and work gloves. The most confrontational thing I'd done before any of this was argue with a line judge at a high school tennis match, and I wasn't even right. I moved to Pinecrest Fairways in the spring of 2019, 2 years after my wife Dolores passed. My daughter Renata thought the neighborhood would be good for me. Manageable yard, some community, no more rattling around in the old farmhouse alone. Pinecrest sat on the western edge of Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. Rolling hills, old-growth oaks, that particular smell of pine resin and wet clay that settles into the air after a summer rain and makes you think everything might be okay. It was beautiful, I'll give it that. What the brochure did not mention was Clarissa Dunmore. Clarissa had been HOA board president for 7 years. She ran unopposed every cycle, not because people liked her, but because nobody wanted the job badly enough to fight her for it. She was the kind of woman who arrived at community events 45 minutes early, so she could arrange the folding chairs herself, and then subtly reorganize them after anyone else touched them. She had a laminated binder. It had tabs. She had opinions on your mailbox flag angle, your porch light wattage, the precise shade of beige your trim was allowed to be. She enforced rules that didn't exist and invented new ones verbally, on the spot, with the calm authority of someone who had never once considered that she might be wrong. The first time I met her, she knocked on my door 2 days after I moved in. She was holding the laminated binder and wearing a blazer, on a Sunday at 9 in the morning, and she told me, in the warm, instructive tone of a kindergarten teacher explaining fire safety, that my recycling bins were 3 inches too visible from the street, that my F-150 was too large for the guest parking zone, and that my wind chime, a copper one Renata had given me the previous Christmas, was potentially actionable under Section 7.4 of the CC and RS. Section 7.4 said nothing about wind chimes. I checked that same afternoon. But I moved it inside anyway, because I was still tired from the move, and I had not yet understood that Clarissa Dunmore interpreted every concession as a permanent surrender. What I also didn't know, at the far northeast corner of the Pinecrest Fairways property, tucked behind a dense stand of old hemlock trees, sat a small private cemetery. 12 graves belonging to the Keswick family, who had farmed this land before selling it to a developer in 1973. Part of that sale included a deed restriction, recorded with Allegheny County in plain language. Those graves were to remain undisturbed in perpetuity. That word, perpetuity, was right there in the document. 3 families in the neighborhood knew about the graves. The Okafor family, the only black family on the street, had a great-grandmother who had worked on the Keswick farm. The Petrov family, Ukrainian-American, first generation, had a grandfather whose headstone stood among the Keswicks because he'd married into that farming community. And old Walt Drury, 83 years old, widower, cane, jar of wildflowers every spring. He had known those graves his entire adult life and visited them like clockwork. None of them had any reason to think the graves were in danger. The deed restriction had been recorded. It was law. Then in February of 2022, Clarissa submitted a proposal to expand the community's 9-hole golf course by 3 additional holes. The board, 4 people she had personally appointed to fill vacancies, people who had learned it was easier to agree with her than to arrive at a meeting prepared to disagree. Approved it in 11 minutes, at 7 in the morning, announced by a 2-line item buried in the monthly newsletter. By June, the hemlocks were stumps. By August, the graves were gone. The morning I found out was a Tuesday in mid-August, the kind of morning where the air sits on you, thick, buzzing with cicadas, smelling of cut grass and hot tar from the road crew 2 streets over. Walt Drury had called me just after 7, his voice cracking so badly I had to ask him twice to slow down. I drove to the northeast corner of the property and got out of the truck. What I found was a construction site, fresh-turned earth the color of brick dust. The hemlock stumps were raw and pale at the center, still weeping sap that caught the morning light. The smell hit me like a wall. Diesel exhaust, overturned clay, that sharp mineral bite of ground that had been left alone for a century and did not appreciate being disturbed. The iron fence that had enclosed the graves was twisted into a loose pile near the tree line, bent at angles that metal only bends when something very large runs through it without slowing down. The headstones were gone, all 12. A backhoe sat 40 feet away, engine off, still ticking as it cooled. A crow perched on the nearest stump and watched me with the patient attention of an animal that has learned humans always do something interesting eventually. Clarissa was standing near the backhoe with her clipboard. She saw me coming. She did not move. "I know what you're going to say," she said before I could open my mouth. Her tone was the one she used for violation notices. Pleasant, firm, the verbal equivalent of a door closing. The board has full authority over common areas. This was a properly authorized project. "There were graves here," I said. "There was an informal memorial area," she said, and she actually made small air quotes with 2 fingers of her clipboard hand, which was not registered with the county and carried no legal protection. I knew, right then, that she was lying. Not guessing, knew. Because 3 months earlier, Clarence Okafor had mentioned the Keswick plot to me in passing, and I'd done what I always do when something catches my interest. I looked it up. Allegheny County Recorder's website, 20 minutes. The deed restriction was right there, recorded October 1973, plain language, binding on all subsequent owners. I hadn't thought much of it at the time because why would I? Who touches graves? "I'd like to see the documentation for your county assessment," I said. She smiled. It was a smile I had come to understand. Wide, patient, the smile of someone who has never had to explain herself to anyone who mattered. "I'll have our attorney put together a summary. I'd like the actual documents." "Of course," she said, and she wrote something on her clipboard. I drove directly to the Allegheny County Recorder's office. The attorney's summary arrived 4 days later. 2 pages, no case numbers, no deed references, citing only a vague title search by an unnamed party. The kind of document that is designed to look official while containing nothing that could be checked. That was Clarissa's first move. Paper as armor. Generate official-looking material, speak with complete confidence, and count on most people not knowing what real documentation looks like. My counter took 1 afternoon and $18. I pulled the original deed records myself, had them certified, and made 6 copies. 1 for Clarence Okafor, 1 for Mara Petrov, the Petrov's daughter, who worked as a paralegal in Pittsburgh, 1 for Walt Drury, 1 for the Clarksburg Tribune, 2 for me. Then I called the Pennsylvania Bureau of Historic Preservation. Here is something worth knowing, and I'd encourage you to actually look this up for your own state, because it's the kind of law that exists everywhere and nobody uses. Under Pennsylvania's History Code, Title 37, Section 302, disturbing a cemetery or burial ground without legal authorization is a criminal offense, not a civil matter. Criminal. The Bureau of Historic Preservation has investigative authority and can refer cases to the Attorney General's office. Destroying graves isn't just morally catastrophic. In Pennsylvania, it can be a felony. Takeaway. If someone disturbs a burial site in your state, don't start with a strongly worded letter. Start with your state's Historic Preservation Bureau. The number is almost always on your state government's website in under 3 clicks. The Bureau sent Agent Teresa Holbrook, compact, gray-haired, early 50s, with the quiet intensity of someone who had been doing this work long enough that each new case made her not sadder, but more precise. She walked the site for 2 hours. She collected samples, photographed the stump fields and the raw earth and the twisted iron fence, and asked me exactly one question before she left. "Do you have documentation of the deed restriction?" I handed her a certified copy on the spot. She looked at it for a long moment. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "don't go anywhere." Meanwhile, Clarissa sent an email to the entire neighborhood that same week, describing the golf course expansion as a community-approved beautification initiative and inviting everyone to a ribbon-cutting celebration at the new 4th hole the following Saturday. She included directions. She included a suggested dress code. Smart casual. I am not making that up. Smart casual. For a ribbon cutting. Over a graveyard. The woman had nerve you could measure in geological units. The ribbon cutting never happened. The Bureau of Historic Preservation issued a cease and desist on the construction project the day before. Orange State Agency stakes appeared in the ground where the 4th hole was supposed to be, and by Friday afternoon, there were 2 Bureau vehicles parked on the access road with their flashers on. I happened to be walking past when Clarissa saw the stakes from across the fairway. I want to be careful about what I say here, because I am a man who tries to be fair. But the expression that crossed her face in that moment, a flicker of something she immediately covered with her default smile, was one of the more satisfying things I have witnessed in my 63 years on this earth. She recovered fast. That was the thing about Clarissa. She was quick. She had, I would learn, been quick her entire adult life, which was probably why she had gone unchallenged for so long. She retained a real estate attorney named Bradford Silas within the week, drove a red Mercedes, wore cufflinks to outdoor meetings, the type. And Bradford fired a letter claiming the deed restriction was unenforceable because the original Keswick family had no living descendants to uphold it. That argument had just enough legal texture to be dangerous. If there was no one with standing to enforce the restriction, it might be challenged in court. Clarissa was betting that the families most affected, the Okafors, the Petrovs, old Walt, lacked either the resources or the stamina to fight. She was wrong on both counts, but she didn't know that yet. Mara Petrov had been busy with genealogy databases for 2 weeks. She found Aldous Keswick, 73, retired schoolteacher, Columbus, Ohio, who had not known his family's graves had been destroyed until Mara called him on a Tuesday evening. She told me afterward that the line went very quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Tell me who I need to call." Aldous drove to Clarksburg the following Saturday. He was tall, thin, deliberate, wire-rimmed glasses, the unhurried movements of a man who had spent decades standing in front of teenagers and had learned that patience was not weakness, but strategy. He walked the site without speaking for a long time, hands in his coat pockets, boots crunching on gravel. The raw earth had started to dry by then, cracking at the surface in that particular way that makes disturbed ground look like something wounded, healing wrong. When he finally spoke, he said, "My grandfather is under there somewhere." Flat and factual. The way you say something that is simply, terribly true. With Aldous as a plaintiff, Bradford Silas's standing argument collapsed. He pivoted to a new angle, filing for a declaratory judgment claiming the deed restriction had been abandoned through non-enforcement. This is a real legal doctrine. If a restriction goes unchallenged long enough, courts can sometimes rule it lapsed. Key thing to know, and this one you really should screenshot. Deed restrictions on cemeteries in Pennsylvania are specifically exempt from abandonment doctrine under case law from Commonwealth versus Storms, 1989. They do not lapse. The state legislature decided, apparently with rare good judgment, that you shouldn't be able to bulldoze a cemetery just because nobody sued you about it for 30 years. Most states have equivalent protections. Search your state plus cemetery deed restriction abandonment doctrine and see what comes up. Our attorney, Vivian Marsh, quiet, meticulous, wore only black, charged fair rates, and had the energy of someone keeping a list, filed a motion to dismiss Bradford's declaratory judgment action on those exact grounds. Judge Dorothy Castle agreed in a ruling so brief it felt like a rebuke. 3 paragraphs. The last sentence noted that the moving party's reading of the governing documents was, quote, strained to the point of implausibility. Vivian read me that sentence over the phone. We were both quiet for a moment in appreciation. But Clarissa still held the board. She still controlled the HOA's money. She still set the meeting schedule. And as long as she held that institutional machinery, she could keep spending resident dues on attorneys, keep the legal process grinding, and keep the rest of the neighborhood insulated from what was actually happening. So I called a neighborhood meeting, Not an HOA meeting. Those required her approval. A community meeting, held in my backyard on a warm September Saturday evening, with folding chairs borrowed from the Presbyterian church 2 blocks over, a cooler full of cold drinks, and string lights Renata helped me hang between the fence posts. 30 of the neighborhood's 44 households showed up. I laid out everything on a folding table. The deed restriction, the Bureau's cease and desist, the dismissed declaratory judgment, Clarissa's 2-page attorney summary next to the actual county records it was supposed to represent. I did not editorialize. I let the documents sit there side by side and did the work themselves. The room went quiet. Then it went the other kind of loud. Harriet Stoll, retired school administrator, 22 years on the street, had never once publicly crossed Clarissa, stood up and said, in the voice of someone spending something they'd saved for a long time, "She lied to us." 2 words. The room shifted. You could feel it, the way air shifts before a storm. Clarissa responded to the backyard meeting with what I can only describe as administrative fury. Within 6 days, 16 households received violation notices, lawn height, fence visibility, a basketball hoop 2 inches past the setback line. My truck, again, in a spot I had been parking in for 3 years without incident. One family got cited for a rain barrel that wasn't, and I want to be precise here, aesthetically integrated into the surrounding landscape architecture. Their rain barrel was brown. It was behind a bush. I went and looked at it myself. It was fine. The citations were retaliation, and everyone knew it, and Clarissa didn't even bother to make them subtle, which told me something. She was rattled. Petty tyrants lean hardest on the machinery when the machinery is the only thing they have left. Here's what most people don't know about HOA violation notices, and this is genuinely useful information. They are only as powerful as the governing documents allow them to be. The Pinecrest Fairways CC&Rs required written notice, then a 30-day cure period, then a formal hearing before the board before any fine could be levied. Vivian walked all 16 cited residents through the process. We requested hearings for every single citation, simultaneously, and we showed up to each one with documentation. The board meetings became 3-hour events. Clarissa, who had been running them in 15 minutes for 7 years because she was essentially talking to herself, began visibly running out of the particular energy that comes from never being challenged. She started arriving with more coffee. Her binder got thicker. Then she went to the press, not the Clarksburg Tribune, which had been covering the Graves story with appropriate sympathy. She went to the Pinecrest Gazette, a neighborhood circular whose editor, a man named Doyle, happened to be her brother-in-law. The headline was, "Activist Faction Threatens Community Harmony with Coordinated Legal Campaign." The article described me as a recently relocated outsider with unclear motives, and quoted an unnamed board member suggesting the situation had generated fear among long-term residents. It did not mention the Graves once. I read it twice. I showed it to Vivienne. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she circled the phrase, "unclear motives," and the word "outsider" with a mechanical pencil and said, "She's leaving fingerprints." She was right, because the smear attempt did what amateur smear attempts always do when there's a real reporter paying attention. It drew exactly the wrong kind of attention. Dominic Ferrante, at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, had been tracking the Bureau of Historic Preservation investigation and the court filings for weeks. Now he had a neighborhood newsletter calling a retiree an outsider for objecting to the demolition of graves. He called me on a Thursday. The story ran the following Tuesday. By Wednesday, it had been picked up by a Pennsylvania news aggregator. By Friday, it was on a National Cemetery Preservation Watchdog site. Clarissa started getting emails from people in states she had probably never thought about. She made one more move before things fully unraveled. She called an emergency board meeting, just the 5 of them. No community notice, technically permissible under a rarely invoked clause, and used it to authorize an additional $40,000 in HOA legal fees from the Community Reserve Fund. $40,000. From dues paid by 30 families to keep fighting a man over his grandfather's grave. That authorization was, as it turned out, the thread that unraveled the whole sweater. Because Roland Faber, a quiet accountant who had been on the board for 2 years, and who I strongly suspect had been profoundly unhappy for approximately 23 months of that tenure, forwarded the emergency meeting minutes to Vivienne. And Vivienne found the number that changed everything. The HOA's course maintenance reserve had been funded for 3 years at $15,000 annually. The balance should have been $45,000. The actual balance, per the most recent financial statement, was $3,200. $42,000 had gone somewhere, and the only person with signature authority on that account was Clarissa Dunmore. Vivian called me on a Sunday evening. She didn't say anything specific on the phone. She just said, "Come to my office Monday morning. Bring every HOA financial document you have, going back 3 years." I had them. Every newsletter, every budget summary, every dues statement, in a manila folder I'd started keeping from month 2 of living in Pinecrest. Call it pipefitter instinct. 30 years of working on systems that could fail catastrophically taught me to keep records of anything that looked like it might one day need to be explained. Vivian's office smelled of strong coffee and old case files, the comfortable smell of a person who does serious work in a fixed place and doesn't apologize for it. She laid 4 years of HOA financial summaries across her conference table and walked me through them with a mechanical pencil, tapping figures with the quiet focus of someone following a trail. The course expansion had cost approximately $180,000 per contractor invoices obtained through discovery in Aldous Keswick's civil case. The HOA had authorized $95,000 for the project. The remaining $85,000 had come from a line item Clarissa had described in board minutes as external development contributions, no contributor named. The contributor was Green Summit Leisure LLC, a real estate development company that had been quietly acquiring parcels in Allegheny County for 3 years. Wholly owned by a holding company whose registered agent was Bradford Silas, the same attorney currently billing the HOA to fight the grave restoration lawsuit. Read that again, because it takes a second to land. The HOA's attorney, the man Clarissa had hired to defend the board against the legal consequences of destroying the graves, had a direct financial stake in the company that had paid for the destruction. He had helped arrange the deal and was now helping defend it. In Pennsylvania, that is a textbook conflict of interest under Rules of Professional Conduct 1.7. It is also, depending on how the money moved, potentially commercial bribery under state statute. And it answered the question I had been sitting with for months. Why would Clarissa, whose entire identity was built on enforcing petty neighborhood rules, blow up a legally recorded deed restriction and destroy 12 graves for 3 extra golf holes? Because she was getting paid to. Green Summit Leisure had plans for a luxury residential development on a parcel adjacent to Pinecrest Fairways. An expanded 18-hole private golf course was a central selling point for that development. Clarissa had apparently been promised a consulting contract and a seat on the LLC's advisory board. We later confirmed this through deposition. She had been selling out her own neighborhood for a payout she hadn't even collected yet. The $42,000 missing from the course maintenance reserve? That was her advance, paid to herself through a single-member LLC she had formed 6 months before the course expansion vote. The LLC was on the Pennsylvania Secretary of State's website. Vivian found it in under an hour. Third legal nugget, and pay attention to this one. HOA board members are fiduciaries. That is not a technicality. It means they owe a legal duty of loyalty to the residents they represent, the same duty a corporate officer owes to shareholders. Using HOA funds to personally benefit yourself is a breach of fiduciary duty and exposes you to civil liability and potential criminal fraud charges. This is true in virtually every state. Search HOA board fiduciary duty plus your state name. If your board spending doesn't add up, this is the statute you want. Vivian closed her folder. She looked at me over her coffee mug. She didn't just break the law, she said. She stole from your neighbors to do it. I drove home and sat in my truck in the driveway for a while. The wind chime Renata had given me, the one I'd finally put back outside 6 months ago, was moving in the evening air, making that soft, off-key clatter. I thought, okay, time to build the trap. The plan ran on 3 tracks simultaneously: legal, financial, and community. Every piece had to land in sequence, or the whole thing would be a moral victory without teeth. And I had not spent 6 months documenting HOA violations and certified deed records for a moral victory. On the legal track, Vivian filed a second civil complaint naming Clarissa personally, not just as board president, but as an individual, for breach of fiduciary duty and self-dealing. She filed a separate complaint with the Pennsylvania Attorney General's Consumer Protection Bureau regarding the undisclosed financial conflict. Then she filed a complaint with the Pennsylvania Disciplinary Board about Bradford Silas. She mentioned this last one almost as an afterthought, the way someone mentions they also packed a spare tire, but the particular quality of her voice when she said it suggested she had been looking forward to filing it for some time. On the financial track, Mara Petrov organized the formal audit demand. Under Pennsylvania's Uniform Planned Community Act, homeowners can force an independent financial audit of HOA records by gathering signatures from at least 20% of the membership. We had 70%. Vivian sent the demand with the signatures attached. 11 pages, certified mail. Clarissa had 30 days to comply or face a court order. We knew she'd try to run the clock. We built that into the plan. Clarence Okafor handled the community track, and Clarence brought to it the organizational precision of a man who had spent 20 years running construction schedules. His key insight came from reading the CC&Rs the way I read gas line schematics, looking not for what was there, but for what wasn't. The governing documents required an annual meeting open to all residents, with 30 days written notice, at which the full financial report had to be presented, and residents could vote on board membership. Clarissa had been scheduling these at 7 in the morning on Thursdays to suppress attendance, but the CC&Rs did not specify who had to send the notice. They specified only that written notice had to be delivered to each household, so we delivered it ourselves, a proper CC&R compliant notice, citing the correct section numbers, listing all required agenda items, referencing the financial report obligation, for a community meeting at 7 in the evening on the third Thursday of November, at the Clarksburg Community Center 2 miles away, which Clarence had reserved in his own name. We slid it under every door on a Sunday morning, 2 people per block, and took time-stamped photographs of each delivery. Clarissa sent her own notice the next morning, same date, 7 a.m., at the HOA's usual location in her 3-car garage, which meant 2 notices, same date, different times, different venues. Vivian had anticipated this. Under the CC&Rs, both meetings were technically valid as noticed, but only one would have a quorum, 40% of households required, and only ours would have residents who were actually awake and willing to drive 2 miles to attend. Clarissa's 7 a.m. garage meetings had historically attracted herself, the 4 board members she'd appointed, and occasionally Gordon Pratt, who lived next door to her and had the look of a man who'd stopped making independent decisions sometime around 2017. We invited guests to ours. Aldous Keswick drove up from Columbus. Dominic Ferrante from the Post-Gazette was coming. Agent Holbrook from the Bureau of Historic Preservation planned to attend as a private citizen. And Vivian had arranged for a CPA named Bertram Schultz, methodical, even-tempered, the kind of man who color-coded spreadsheets not for aesthetics, but because he genuinely believed that clarity was a form of respect, to present the financial audit findings, which he had completed 2 weeks ahead of schedule. Bertram's charts used red for unauthorized expenditures and blue for legitimate HOA spending. When he showed me the draft presentation in his office, I looked at the ratio of red to blue and said something unprintable. Bertram nodded sympathetically and said he had said something similar when he ran the numbers the first time. Walt Drury asked if there was anything he could do to help. I told him I needed him in the front row at the community meeting, and I needed him to bring the jar of flowers he used to take to the graves. He said he'd pressed some fresh larkspur from his garden, brilliant purple-blue, paper-thin petals, the kind that crumple beautifully when they dry. He'd been growing them for 40 years. I told him that was exactly right. The last piece was Roland Faber. He sent a formal written request to Clarissa to produce the HOA's complete financial records for presentation at the annual meeting. Certified mail. Copy to Vivian. Copy to the Allegheny County Register of Deeds. Clarissa responded in one line. She would have her attorney review the request. 22 days left on the audit clock. Clarissa spent the 2 weeks before the annual meeting trying to blow up the chessboard. First move. A new attorney. Bradford Silas was no longer available, for obvious reasons, who filed an emergency motion to invalidate our community meeting notice on the grounds that only the board had authority to call an annual meeting. Vivian responded in 48 hours with a brief that cited the actual CC&R language, which said no such thing, and 3 prior Pennsylvania cases where identical arguments had failed. Judge Dorothy Castle denied the motion in 5 sentences. The 4th sentence used the word unpersuasive. The 5th suggested that continued filings of this nature might warrant sanctions. Vivian sent me that ruling by text message, with 0 commentary. She didn't need to add any. Second move, and this one was uglier. Clarissa began calling residents individually. We learned this the same way you learn everything in a neighborhood, because people talk, and most people talk to someone who talks to someone who talks to Clarence Okafor, who talks to me. She was telling people the community meeting was organized by outside interests, trying to force unwanted changes on the neighborhood. She was deliberately vague about what those changes were. When pressed, she implied, never stated, always implied, that the goal involved low-income development on the adjacent parcel. I want to be direct about what that was. The Okafor family was the only black family in Pinecrest Fairways. The insinuation Clarissa was trafficking in those quiet phone calls, was not ambiguous to anyone listening carefully. Clarence heard about it within 48 hours because Harriet Stoll called him herself, her voice taut with an emotion that sounded like fury and mortification mixed in equal parts. Vivian documented it in writing and added it to the file. It would come up again. Third move, and this one genuinely surprised me, because it required more logistical effort than I would have expected from someone already fighting on 3 legal fronts. Clarissa hired a private security firm to station personnel at the neighborhood entrance on the evening of the community meeting, with instructions to turn away any non-residents on the grounds that it was a private community event. She was trying to keep Aldous Keswick out, the man whose grandfather's grave she had destroyed. She was going to have a security guard turn him away at a gate. I found out about the security company 2 days before the meeting from a neighbor who'd overheard a phone call. I called Dominic Ferrante and told him exactly what the plan was, who Aldous was, why he was coming, and what it would look like on camera if a uniformed security guard turned him away at a residential gate to prevent him from attending a public community meeting about his family's demolished graves. Dominic arrived at the gate 90 minutes before the meeting, with a photographer and a press credential. The security company, it turned out, had been given a job description that omitted several relevant details. When the guard on duty looked up from his clipboard and registered a reporter with a notebook and a photographer with a long lens, he made a phone call, then another. Then he stepped aside. Aldous Keswick walked through that gate in his good coat, wire-rimmed glasses catching the parking lot lights, and Dominic Ferrante was 3 steps behind him, and I was watching all of it on a live stream that Clarence had set up from across the street on his phone. The security guard, to his genuine credit, looked like he would have preferred to be literally anywhere else on Earth. Inside the community center, Clarissa's name came up exactly once during setup, when Bertram Schultz asked me whether she was expected to attend. I told him I didn't know. He nodded and arranged his color-coded charts, with the focused calm of a man who was entirely comfortable with whatever happened next. Walt Drury arrived at 6:40, 20 minutes early, wool coat, wooden cane, mason jar of dried larkspur in his left hand. His daughter Penny had driven up from Morgantown to be with him. She helped him to the front row and sat beside him and didn't say much. She didn't need to. Some things you show up for and let speak for themselves. Clarissa held her 7 a.m. meeting as planned. 4 attendees, including herself. Her new attorney's associate sat in the back. The board treasurer, Gordon Pratt from next door, who said nothing the entire time and left immediately after the vote. In 9 minutes, they ratified the course expansion, reappointed Clarissa as board president, and authorized a further $60,000 in legal fees from HOA reserves. Then, the meeting was adjourned, and Clarissa got in her car. By 6:15 that evening, her white Audi was in the far corner of the community center parking lot, engine running, windows up. Walt Drury's daughter Penny spotted it from the entrance and texted Clarence. Clarence texted me. I was standing at the front of the room, helping Bertram adjust his projector angle, and I read the text and did not look out the window because I did not want to give anything away. She sat there for 37 minutes. I know because Penny timed it. I don't know what Clarissa was thinking in that car. Men like her, people like her, usually don't feel the shape of what's coming until it's already arrived. She had spent 7 years in a position where her assessments of situations were simply correct, because she was the only one assessing them. That kind of certainty is hard to shake, even when the evidence is in the parking lot with a press credential. Inside, the room was filling up. 38 of 44 households represented, comfortably past quorum. The ceilings were the low, flat kind you find in rented meeting halls. The lights that particular yellow-white fluorescent buzz that makes everyone look slightly tired. The room smelled of old carpet and folding chairs, and 3 different kinds of coffee from 3 different thermoses. Aldous Keswick was in the second row. Walt sat in front with his jar of larkspur, brilliant purple-blue even under the bad lights, petals thin as paper. Agent Holbrook had a seat near the back wall with a notepad open. Dominic Ferrante was along the side, scribbling. 2 editors from the Post-Gazette, who had driven up from Pittsburgh because they wanted to see the ending, sat near the door. I thought, so did I. I called the meeting to order at 7:02 and immediately handed the floor to Vivian, because I am a retired pipe fitter, not a lawyer, and the next 45 minutes required a lawyer. Vivian walked the room through the timeline with the unhurried precision of someone who knows the documents are doing the work, and her job is simply not to get in the way. Deed restriction, board vote, site clearance, missing $42,000, Bradford Silas's conflict of interest, Green Summit Leisure LLC, the advance payment, the Secretary of State filing. She used a projector and scanned documents, numbered, dated, sourced, and she spoke in complete sentences without hedging a single word. Bertram followed. The color-coded charts, red for unauthorized, blue for legitimate. The room made a sound when the red chart came up. Not a gasp exactly, more like the kind of collective exhale you hear when something heavy finally hits the floor. Then Aldous Keswick stood up. He spoke for 4 minutes and did not raise his voice once. He talked about his grandfather, a man who had worked this land for 30 years, been buried on it in 1908, had a headstone with his name on it that had stood for over a century. He talked about driving from Columbus and standing on that raw clay in the October cold. He talked about what it means, not legally, not financially, just as a plain human fact, when the place where your people are buried is looked at by someone with a clipboard and called an obstacle. The room was very quiet when he sat down. The vote to remove Clarissa Dunmore as board president, called under the CC&R provision allowing removal of officers for cause. 35 for, 1 against, 2 abstentions. Roland Faber was voted in as interim president on the same ballot. The vote to retain Vivian Marsh's firm as HOA legal counsel, 36 for, 0 against. The vote to pursue full restoration of the gravesite, funded from HOA reserves, and sought from Clarissa Dunmore personally in civil recovery for any shortfall, 36 for, 0 against. It was 9:20 p.m. People were standing in the aisles talking, that particular animated relief of a crowd that has been holding its breath for a long time and has finally been given permission to exhale. Aldous was talking to Clarence by the coffee table. Harriet Stoll was shaking Vivian's hand. Walt Drury's daughter had her arm around his shoulders. The back door opened. Clarissa walked in. Same blazer she always wore to board meetings. Clipboard under one arm, the smile in place, present, practiced, her most reliable tool. But something in her had shifted, the way a building shifts before it settles. Not visibly collapsed, but no longer quite plumb. She looked at the projector screen, still showing Bertram's red and blue chart. She looked at Aldous. She looked at me. "I'd like to address the community," she said. Vivian looked up from her notes with the pleasant neutrality of a judge who has already issued the ruling. "This meeting has adjourned, Ms. Dunmore." Clarissa stood there for a moment, then she turned and walked back out the door. The latch clicked shut behind her. Outside, her Audi started. Its headlights swept once across the community center windows, a brief, pale streak, and then she was gone. The thing about a trap is that by the time it closes, it's already done its work. The community center vote was the ceremony. The trap had been running for 2 months before that, quietly, and it closed on a Wednesday morning in December at the Allegheny County Courthouse. The Pennsylvania Attorney General's office had opened a formal investigation in October, triggered by Vivian's complaint to the Consumer Protection Bureau and accelerated by Bertram Schultz's audit, which he had forwarded directly with a cover letter that was, by all accounts, 4 pages of the most precise and devastating accountant prose ever produced in Allegheny County. The investigation covered HOA financial fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy to defraud homeowners. naming Clarissa Dunmore, Bradford Silas, and Green Summit Leisure, LLC. On that Wednesday, Clarissa was served with civil process in the parking lot of a Whole Foods 8 miles from Pinecrest Fairways. The process server caught her next to her cart, between the organic produce and the checkout. She left the cart where it stood. Dominic Ferrante published the story that evening. He included the detail about the abandoned cart. I did not feel bad about laughing at that. The civil lawsuit Vivian filed on behalf of the neighborhood, and Aldous Keswick specifically, named Clarissa as an individual, named Bradford Silas, and named Green Summit Leisure LLC. It sought recovery of the $42,000 in missing reserve funds, the full cost of gravesite restoration, compensatory damages for the Keswick, Okafor, and Petrov families, and punitive damages, available in Pennsylvania when a defendant's conduct is willful, malicious, and contemptuous of others' legal rights. Vivian pursued the punitive claim with the focused enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting a long time for a case that earned it. Bradford Silas's disciplinary hearing concluded in the spring. His license was suspended for 20 months. The written decision used the phrase, "profound conflict of interest," twice, and "failure of professional judgment," 3 times. He relocated to a different state to resume practice. I have no further information on this and require none. But the moment, the single, clear, visual moment that lives in my memory as the real ending, did not happen in a courthouse. It happened on a cold Saturday in February, on the northeast corner of the Pinecrest Fairways property, under a Pennsylvania winter sky the color of old pewter. Frozen ground, bare trees, the kind of cold that settles into your collar and stays. Clarence Okafor had organized the restoration crew, 12 volunteers in work gloves and insulated boots, boots crunching on frost-stiff grass, breath fogging in the still air. The Bureau of Historic Preservation had completed its forensic analysis and located each of the 12 burial plots precisely. New headstones, granite, permanent, engraved from historical records and Aldous Keswick's family documents, had been funded from the recovered HOA reserves, with the shortfall covered by a personal contribution from Roland Faber, who said quietly at the planning meeting that he should have spoken up 2 years sooner. Aldous was there. Walt was there in his wool coat and his wife's knitted scarf, leaning on his cane, mason jar of fresh larkspur in his hand, purple blue and paper thin, brilliant against the gray morning. The Okafor family came. The Petrovs came. Harriet Stoll came. 31 households were represented, which is most of them, which is the neighborhood. Agent Holbrook was there. Dominic Ferrante was there. 2 Pittsburgh TV news cameras stood at a respectful distance. I was there. Clarissa Dunmore was not. She had moved out of Pinecrest Fairways 6 weeks earlier, into a rental in a different county, while her attorneys managed her legal exposure. The white Audi was gone. Her mailbox stood empty. Her lawn, and I want you to appreciate the particular perfection of this detail, was overgrown. Technically in violation of CC&R Section 6.2. Roland Faber, our new board president, had decided the neighborhood had more important priorities than citing empty houses. When the first headstone was set into the restored earth, Elias Keswick, 1841 to 1908, beloved father and steward of this land, Aldous put his hand on it. He held it there for a long moment. Then he stepped back and looked up at the bare tree canopy, the branches tracing black lines against the pewter sky. Someone played a hymn softly from a phone speaker, an old shape-note tune, thin and clear in the cold. Aldous had chosen it. I was standing next to Walt Drury. He smelled of pipe tobacco and wool, and the larkspur in his jar was very bright, and neither of us said anything for a while because there was nothing to say that the moment wasn't already saying for itself. That was the mic drop. Not the lawsuit, not the AG investigation, not the vote, not Clarissa's abandoned grocery cart. It was 12 headstones going back into the ground where they belonged, surrounded by people who had decided that some things matter more than being comfortable. Turns out, that's a majority. Here's where things landed. Clarissa Dunmore settled the civil suit 14 months later for $228,000. The missing reserve funds, full gravesite restoration costs, legal fees, and a portion of damages for the Keswick, Okafor, and Petrov families. The Attorney General's office extracted a separate resolution. Clarissa pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor count of financial exploitation of a homeowners association, paid fines, performed community service, and was legally barred from serving on any HOA board in Pennsylvania for 15 years. Her LLC was dissolved. The consulting contract she'd been promised by Green Summit Leisure was never executed because Green Summit Leisure no longer existed in any form that could execute contracts. Bradford Silas's law license suspension held on appeal. He is, as of the last information I have, practicing in a different state under different oversight. The disciplinary board's written decision is a matter of public record, if you're curious. Green Summit Leisure LLC and its associated holding companies became the subject of a broader regulatory review of development practices in Allegheny County that I won't pretend to fully understand. What I can tell you is that the luxury residential development never broke ground. The adjacent parcel was purchased by the county 2 years later and converted to a nature preserve. There are walking trails now. They are well maintained. Roland Faber served as interim board president for 18 months before stepping aside for a newly elected board. 3 women and 2 men, all people who had been in that community center room, all people who carried something in their faces that I can only describe as the specific thoughtfulness of people who have been through something hard and paid attention. HOA dues were reduced by $35 a month once the legal fees cleared and the finances were properly audited. The golf course remains 9 holes. Nobody has petitioned to expand it. Walt Drury passed away the following spring, peacefully, at 84, in his own home. His daughter told me he had been glad the graves were restored before he went, mentioned it more than once in his last months, not with urgency, but with the settled satisfaction of a man who'd seen something put right that needed to be. I think about him every time the larkspur comes up in the garden I've started keeping on my back fence. I didn't used to garden. It turns out I find it useful. Clarence Okafor and I have dinner once a month. He is a significantly better cook than I am, a fact he raises approximately every 40 minutes when we're together. I have stopped objecting because he is not wrong. Aldous Keswick was central to what came next, the Keswick Farm Heritage Fund, a nonprofit established jointly by the Keswick family, the Okafor family, and the Pinecrest Fairways Community Association. The fund provides 2 annual scholarships, $2,500 each, to graduating seniors in Allegheny County pursuing studies in environmental stewardship, local history, or community service. Aldous wrote the selection criteria himself. He was, after all, a very good teacher. The first recipient was a 17-year-old from a neighborhood 2 miles away who had written her senior project on the history of black farming communities in western Pennsylvania. She gave a 4-minute speech at the awards ceremony that made Clarence Okafor cry, which he will deny if you ask him about it, but Harriet Stoll was there, and she will confirm it. The restored cemetery is maintained by the community now. Small iron fence, gravel path, good drainage. In the spring, someone always leaves flowers. Sometimes it's me. I still drive the 09 F150. The cracked dashboard is still there. The wind chime is outside where it belongs, and on a quiet evening, you can hear it from the front yard. That soft, off-key clatter Renata picked out because she thought her old man needed more music in his life. She was right about that, as it turns out. She's right about most things.